Last year, my wife and I visited every county town in the East Midlands.
Away we go.
Okay, quick geography lesson for context. This is the UK, and these are the East Midlands. Now get rid of half those counties because the title of this video is a lie. We visited Leicestershire, Derbyshire, and Nottinghamshire. So first off on our journey was the city of Leicester, which was easily the ugliest place we went to. It didn't help that the weather was kind of miserable, but more to the point, it didn't help that the city just had no real character. There were just ugly buildings all over the place, especially by the bus stop.
You know, it's not a really aesthetic place when the graffiti's the nicest looking part of it.
Fortunately, the first place we were heading to was a park, away from all the ugly buildings.
So the enduring theme of every single time we ever go on a city break is, with the exception actually of Washington DC. Washington DC is the one notable exception, but every other time I'm consistently staggered by how close everything actually is to each other. Google Maps said it would take us 16 minutes to walk to Abbey Park. It's been about 5 minutes of walking. Basic summary of the information is that it was a park or grounds for an abbey, but then the abbey was dissolved after the Reformation, and then it was bought by various wealthy people until, as seems to consistently happen, the wealthy people were no longer able to take care of it, so they kindly donated it for the public good. I donate it for the public bad. Look, it's gooses. And there's one singular geese. And there's the sad old man bench. But even then, the sad old man bench isn't that close to the water. I feel like that makes for some extra sad men. They're like sat here and are like, I can't even reach the ducks.
We spent quite a while walking around the park because it was basically two separate areas, the actual park and the old abbey ruins. There were a few other things going on by the abbey ruins as well.
Wow, look at me go!
It makes you look, you're like walking like a toy. Dum, dum, dum. I can't help but feel like we're not getting the full effect of these flower gardens.
Overall, definitely a nice way to refresh our mindset after being confronted by the ugly buildings beforehand. Although honestly, after a while, the sheer grit of the town centre started to develop a certain appeal.
That looks like some kind of prison. It's totally barred up, and it's got razor spikes around it. There is a statue. It's miners or rail workers? Rail workers, surely. Oh, football players. Oh, sports players. Cricket. Duh, that took ages. And there's the clock closer up.
After this, we went to probably the best reason to visit Leicester, which is the Richard III Museum. This museum has two main functions, the first of which is to be a broader museum about the War of the Roses, which is a war most famous now for being the vague inspiration for Game of Thrones.
He even allowed her 7-year-old son, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, to choose the method of execution for 2 captured Yorkists.
Do you think we should raise our kid like that?
We could try.
Yeah. Depends if we capture any Yorkists.
In that regard, it was pretty exciting because in general, big battles are pretty exciting.
It's about to kick off.
Although I did at one point realise, as I often do at museums, that they have a lot of information made kind of redundant by the fact you could just watch a documentary about the topic in the comfort of your own home, so reading that information at the museum is a bit unnecessary.
I didn't know he needed a guard for his large rear.
Oh my god.
But the other focus of the museum, and the thing that really recommends it, is the focus it puts on our perception of Richard III. See, Richard III was the last king of his dynasty before the Tudors took over, and then Shakespeare wrote about Richard III under the reign of the Tudors. So maybe Shakespeare had an incentive to present Richard III as worse than he actually was. In this sense, the museum becomes more about analysing history as a story we tell ourselves.
The travel vlogs are imploding on themselves. Ooh.
And there's another dimension to this based on the fact that Richard III had scoliosis, and thus the museum questions our tendency to associate physical deformity with moral evil. For context, my wife Hannah has scoliosis, so this was relevant to her.
Do you think all people who had scoliosis are evil?
Some of them.
Some of them, yeah, that's true. Some of them.
With a face like that, I'm surprised he didn't die sooner.
You also get to see the story around how Richard III's body was found after being lost for a long time, where his body was found, and how they confirmed it was him.
Overall, I think the Richard III Museum was quite interesting.
Based on the relevance of the topic to Leicester specifically, in addition to the interesting way they handled the topic, I'd probably say the Richard III Museum is easily the highlight of things to do in Leicester.
There's the cathedral. And I guess that's him, Richard III.
After this we had lunch at a place that does poutine. I don't know why it did poutine, obviously we weren't in Canada, but I'll say that having been to Canada, this was nicer than any poutine we had there, mostly because instead of just boring cheese and gravy, Hannah had a marinara poutine and I had a pulled pork poutine. It was really good, I'd highly recommend. In other good news, we also discovered that there's a part of the town centre that looks pretty nice. The city just doesn't make a good first impression by having specifically the area around the bus station be incredibly ugly.
All I read was Leicester Adult E, and at first I was like, is this going to be Leicester Adult Entertainment?
After this we headed to the Leicester Museum and Art Gallery, which had a much less singular focus than the Richard III Museum. It had an exhibition on the experience of Asians who were forced to flee Uganda and came as refugees to the UK.
Idi Amin? I tell you what, I think he was a meanie. Huh?
The local relevance is that Leicester has a very large Indian population for which it is quite famous, and it was interesting to go to a museum that presented their stories.
Seeing trees with no leaves was strange. I just thought that trees in Britain were like that, so I was amazed in spring when leaves started to grow on the trees. We had never seen snow before we came to England.
The other thing I liked about it was that it presented a quite nuanced view on race relations by the very nature of being an exhibition about South Asians who were persecuted by black nationalists in Africa.
Time for a proper Brexit march. We don't want any more immigrants in Brexit England, blah blah blah.
The next exhibition, though, had absolutely nothing to do with Leicester's history, since it was just an exhibition about Egyptian history. There really isn't any connection between Leicester and ancient Egypt, so I guess they just had the exhibition because it felt like something you're supposed to do. One thing they had, which I've actually never seen before, is fully exposed mummified Egyptian bodies, such that you could actually even see the faces of the dead people. Now, honestly, the idea of seeing a literal dead body makes me feel kind of gross. But I aspire to be the type of person who has a certain reverence that makes me have a more sophisticated emotional reaction to seeing the body of somebody who lived thousands of years ago. Speaking of reverence, I did film the bodies because I was filming a lot of stuff, but I've decided not to include that footage here because it just didn't feel very respectful. So then we went to the art gallery section, which I don't have that many strong opinions about.
We saw better stuff than that in the underpass.
We did.
I'll just include some footage of the different paintings and say that I found some of them visually interesting and some of them not so much.
Yeah, so this is like the little kid art gallery section. Which, I don't know, like, I could make a hilarious joke about how, you know, some of these don't look so different from the newfangled modern art we've seen.
That's cool looking.
It's actually really cool looking. Oh, and it's the Attenborough Prize winner. Okay. So, and it's worth £1,400. Okay. That's me told. Just walking around like, oh, isn't it all just like, isn't it all just in the eye of the beholder and things like that? And it turns out that here I am with the officially approved taste.
Then there was a dinosaur section, which felt a little bit like the museum struggling to compete with the big boys of natural history, but it sort of justified itself by focusing on dinosaurs that had actually been discovered locally.
My mum asked me, what's my favourite dinosaur? And I said, possibly the Neovenator.
And she said, shut up. No, but the thing is, like, I just like it because I think it looks cool. But, like, oh wow, isn't that cool? Because, like, it's from Leicester.
Anyway, up until this point, we thought we'd been pacing ourselves quite well, but we suddenly discovered that there was a whole other section of the museum that we barely had any time left to explore, so we pretty much just rushed through that. The final stretch of the museum seemed to be varied, including a small exhibition on LGB history in Leicester.
Don't worry, Hannah, you can swim in swimming pools even if you have AIDS.
Phew.
Now you just have to worry about dying.
There's a statue. I don't know who John Biggs is, but I'll be sure to find out.
He was a local MP, but In looking up who he was, I found out that somewhat humorously, his statue was at one point run over by a tram. After this, we went to another local history museum that was based in 2 Tudor buildings called the Newark Houses. I don't know whether it's the fact that we only got to this museum at approaching closing time, so sort of had to rush around, or the fact that we'd already been to 2 local history museums at this point.
If only we could find out more about East Africa and Uganda in relation to Leicester. Unfortunately, there was no such opportunity.
Or the fact that as I'm putting this video together, I'm mindful that I want to be quite aggressive in terms of editing it down, but I don't think that there's too much that I need to mention from this museum.
Santa Claus is coming to town.
It was basically just another local history museum.
When we were talking about it, Mum was like, hey, you know, this guy's the fattest man ever. And there he is. That makes so much sense, yeah. He was a major celebrity and a much admired national symbol.
The only new thing it offered was a look into the history of a Leicester regiment in the military.
Trench ASMR. Okay guys, so we're going to be going over the top now. Okay. Oh no. I think they'll stop firing soon.
But like I say, it was quite close to closing time, so we were only there briefly. But there was one small museum that was open until half an hour later, so we headed there just to check it out. Again, it was another basic local history museum, although it did have a library room which had quite a nice ambiance. I assume everybody shares my passion for antiquated libraries, but this library was pretty small. Then we were able to head down to a dungeon area.
The ass sizes were also held at the castle. So when someone was dying, or had died, they would be held up so their body would be displayed. Is it worth taking the time, now we've left the Guildhall Museum, to have a look at Leicester Cathedral? Yeah, it's quite a walk, isn't it?
The cathedral was closed, so that didn't happen. So instead we headed through the centre, which was looking much nicer now with the Christmas lights on, and then we stumbled upon this weird Christmas dubstep show that was just happening at one of the squares. Which we seemed to be the only people paying attention to. Then off to the train station.
The Leicester Seamstress. Thomas Cook. Oh, that's cool.
One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that during this whole time there were rail strikes going on, so we specifically chose this area because there weren't rail strikes happening on any of the East Midlands lines. However, there were knock-on effects that we didn't anticipate from the other cancellations, but eventually we got to my grandparents' house, and this is the other key detail I've been withholding. See, my grandparents live in Loughborough. If you were to draw a triangle connecting all the cities we visited on this trip, then Loughborough would be in the middle, so it was a great base to spend the night. And honestly, that was really lovely. I didn't film too much of it, but basically they have a very nice cozy house, and it was really relaxing to get there after a long day walking around these cities. I sort of wish I'd filmed my grandparents more, but I did film them for our first ever vlog, which was uploaded to Hannah's channel, so I will link that for your benefit. One other point really quickly is that my grandparents sort of have a bit of a Hobbit thing going on, where they have a half dozen courses for every meal. It's very easy to get used to.
Look at that cheese. Remember when we saw a dead body?
Anyway, the next day we missed the train, but this turned out to be sort of a blessing in disguise because there are nothing but villages between Loughborough and Derby, and riding a bus through the English countryside is one of life's few great unadulterated joys. Well, we also went past the East Midlands airport, which I suppose isn't exactly a village-like atmosphere.
Here we are at the Derby Riverside Gardens, which I don't actually think there is much to.
Derby actually has a reputation for being a pretty unpleasant place. There were genuinely some people who were confused when I explained we were just visiting as tourists. However, we were shocked by how nice the city actually looked, especially compared to Leicester.
Derby is supposed to be like ugly and disgusting and no one would want to go there. But looking around now, like, I would believe you if you told me this was London.
And spoiler alert, but this actually ended up being our favourite of the 3 cities we visited.
Some interesting things by this tree. I don't know what they're about.
Anyway, the first stop was a classic old stately home functioning as a local history museum. This one was called Pickford House. There were lots of rooms mocked up to look how they would have looked back during the time when the owner of the house lived there. And then of course there was also some information about the local and wider historical context of the house.
He's talking about
slavery. As of course, one must when considering these places from the past when slavery happened.
What was slightly strange is that on the upper floor they had a random exhibition of clothes from the 1960s. It seemed that whoever was the benefactor who donated the house to be a museum also was a collector of 1960s fashion pieces, so they just decided to add that in as well.
Wouldn't it be crazy if actually, unbeknownst to us, Georgian houses did have random exhibits on 1960s fashion? Turns out it was completely authentic.
Overall, this was a good start to our visit and helped ground us in the history of the local area.
What I'll do is I'll edge... Well done.
We got to Derby a little late due to missing our train, so it was already time for lunch.
Experimental road closure. That's an interesting way of putting it.
But on the way there, we came upon an old church which was open. I always check the doors of churches to see if they're open so we can have a look around. This one was, but we found out from the lady inside that it wasn't supposed to be open. She still let us have a look around though.
So is this like Church of England? Yeah, okay, yeah.
The pub that I planned for us to eat at was closed, so we explored the town centre for a little while, and again confirmed that the area was quite nice, before finding another place to have lunch. This place was well reviewed, but I was a little suspicious because it was also a nightclub, so I didn't know if the good reviews were for the food or the nightlife. I can say for my part though that the food was pretty good. After this we went to another generic local history museum. Much like Leicester, this was a nice opportunity to get an impression of some of the local history. Interestingly, it had a lot more prehistoric stuff than Leicester, so I guess Stone Age Britons shared our enthusiasm for Derby over Leicester.
The swastika symbolised the sun's rays and was thought to bring good luck.
Oh, I mean, 10.
Number 10 is a bronze phallic amulet.
In addition to prehistory though, there was a broader look at the history of the local area.
So this here is a ruined longboat. That's quite impressive.
Probably a highlight was a model they'd made of what the city would have looked like during the Middle Ages. Also, like Leicester, they had an exhibition dedicated to a local military regiment, which did a good job at connecting the local history to more global matters. And they had a natural history section, which again seemed to be mostly focused on local natural history, which is my preference if I'm visiting a place.
So this is an actual hippo that used to live in England.
Although I understand that people who live in Derby probably want their local museum to contain information about the wider world.
I know I shouldn't be that because I know like fur's a thing. I don't know, it's just creepy to me to think like it's a dead thing.
On that note, this place also had fully exposed faces of long dead mummies.
This exhibit contains the remains of 2 ancient Egyptian people. If you do not wish to see these, please take a different route around the museum.
I don't know what's going on in the East Midlands, but I visited many Egyptian history exhibitions before, and I don't recall being able to see the actual dead bodies, but suddenly I'd encountered this 2 times in as many days. Anyway, they also had what I guess I'm going to call a representation section of the museum, so there was a specific section for women's history, and then there was also a section about African history.
This time for Africa. Except that's Indian.
Although I don't think that Derby has a particularly black population. So there wasn't much of a local history element to this. But the one big part of local history that they honestly should have leaned more into was exploring the role of Derby in the Jacobite Wars. See, during the Jacobite uprising of 1745, the Scottish army marched as far south as Derby before retreating and eventually being defeated.
Here's a statue to the traitor, Prince Charles.
This was the last substantial Jacobite military activity, so I feel like it should get more focus as Derby played a significant role in a major part of British history. After this, we ended up walking past a church that my grandmother had told us about before we headed out that day.
My grandma was like, oh, there's a chapel by a bridge. And she made it sound like it was going to be like this kind of nice, like beautiful kind of over a river, like so lovely looking. And look, it's just an ugly concrete bridge. I don't think this is going to be open, but let's see.
And then we headed to our final museum of the day.
This is the penultimate thing we're doing. It's the Museum of Making.
This museum was honestly pretty impressive. It was built in a former factory connected to an old watermill, and they had made a lot of good use of that space. It was very interactive, and there were some fun opportunities to engage with the activities.
You successfully made a sign for your favourite Bible verse, Romans 5:10.
I sure did.
That's so good.
Ew! Why do I look like an elf?
I think I just view you like an elf. I think I just view you as an elf.
I think that's
I
the
look like
conclusion
I'm
there.
from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun.
And there was also some interesting information. One thing I remember is that they had these old halfpenny coins that actually weren't legal tender, but they were just accepted by everybody because all the existing coins were too valuable. Nowadays, with inflation being such an issue, it's crazy to think that there was once a time when people were literally having to invent currency that was less valuable.
Barometer? Barotograph?
They also had this visually impressive model railway on the top floor.
Tell you what, one of the things at the park that we didn't end up going to was a railway thing, a miniature railway. That is so cool, actually. Like, I'm into that in a big way.
Overall, the museum was really interesting and I would very much recommend it. After that we went to Derby Cathedral for the evening. It was very pretty and a great way to round out the day by relaxing and sitting there in quiet serenity until we decided to head home.
There was a thing about this guy in the museum, and I didn't really regard it very highly. But then when we went into the subsequent place, wherever that was, the Museum of Making, it was said that he's actually one of the most famous people from Derby, and that's his little memorial stone.
Heading home wasn't uncomplicated. It took us a while to work out what method of travelling made the most sense, and then when we decided on getting a coach, the card reader wasn't working, so I had to run to a shop to get some cash, and then he wasn't able to give us change, so we wasted a bit of money there, and then my granddad wasn't able to find us to pick us up, so we were waiting in the town centre for a while.
On the evening of 31st January 1916, a German Zeppelin bombed Leicester, killing 10 people, injuring 12, causing considerable damage.
Overall, a day that was pretty hectic, but enjoyable. The next day, we took the train to Nottingham for our final visit.
Well, that went smoothly.
Interesting side note, my granddad was actually involved in deciding where the yellow line should be at train stations. He also told me that Nottingham Castle, which was the first place we were heading to, was in fact not a castle, but just a fortified manor house, so it's not a medieval castle that would fit well into a Robin Hood story. The castle wasn't open that day, so we didn't go inside it, but apparently inside it's mostly a generic museum and art gallery, rather than being particularly focused on being a castle, which makes sense because it's not a castle. On the way there though, we did see an inn claiming to be the oldest in England, but a lot of inns and pubs make that claim.
I mean, it's still not miserable looking. There we go, that's my compliment for the day.
After this we headed to the Cathedral Church of St. Barnabas. I guess with all these churches we're overdue for a quick Gregorian chants montage.
It wasn't as colourful. I thought Catholics had their churches colourful, and then Orthodox just took the cake, frankly. I thought Orthodox churches were crazy and over the top and really colourful.
And after this we went to a very large cemetery in the middle of the city.
We all die.
I'm a really big fan of cemeteries, as I just find that they have a really distinct atmosphere.
What I'm noticing is that way too many people in Nottingham have normal names. There's George, there's John, there's William, Sarah.
Significantly, we were able to complete our trifecta of uncomfortable moments involving dead bodies.
If that's a rabbit's burrow, it's a rabbit's burrow which most likely intercepts with a dead body.
Ew.
Which is...
Oh,
there are rabbits right now in there, living in some guy's skull. Oh, lovely little, this is our rumpus room.
So after walking through the cemetery for a surprisingly long time, we eventually made it to the Arboretum, which I must admit probably isn't the best thing to visit when all the leaves have fallen.
It was with great disappointment, I must reveal, that I believe that is the formal gardens. And I suppose it qualifies insofar as things that are formal tend to be rather drab. Maybe we should have gone to the quirky, fun, casual gardens instead.
The main thing that stood out to me was this tower called the Chinese Bell Tower. It wasn't obvious to me in what way it was Chinese, and the good people of Nottingham have a shameful habit of graffitiing their own information plaques. A basic summary I found out through research is that the bell was looted from a monastery during the Opium War, which is why it's surrounded by cannons, even though the cannons are actually from the Crimean War. Anyway, after this we fed a squirrel.
Yeah. Oh my lord, that's so cool. You fed a squirrel.
Hi.
Oh!
Look at it. Oh.
Someone's gonna comment like, "Oh, you shouldn't feed squirrels. It's not good."
Oh, look how cute.
Don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm sure there's legitimate concerns, but yeah, that's a good counterpoint. Look at his little hands.
Honestly, feeding a squirrel was an unexpected highlight, simply because I've never met a squirrel before who wasn't so timid as to run away from me.
There you go. Aww.
After this, we then walked down to the main city centre. Much like many of the other places we went to, there seemed to be almost two town centres. The town centre you arrive at through public transport, which is generally an ugly post-industrial hellscape, and the actual town centre, which is incredibly antiquated and pretty.
So the upshot is, this is a plaque that basically says, you can't build a road here.
Once we got to the market square, we discovered that it was actually a lot more elaborate than we'd expected, as they put on a Christmas fair. We didn't spend a huge amount of time there, but we ambled around for a bit before heading off, whereupon we encountered another church.
Everyone is welcome at this church, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, religion, race, nationality, and this is like, yeah, okay.
The minister at the church was talking to people about the history, so we looked around while eavesdropping a bit on some of the historical trivia, before eventually being able to talk to him ourselves.
Well, it's also ended up a bit lopsided, because obviously that's way more...
Everything in
Yeah, okay, everything's lopsided.
There's no symmetry in here.
Okay,
at all,
wow.
Which I think adds to its charm.
Yeah, I would agree.
While talking to him, I found an answer to something I'd been wondering earlier that day. See, at the Arboretum, I made the following observation.
We've walked up a lot of hills.
Oh my gosh.
Too many. And it's weird because the castle seems to therefore like... I feel like with a clear line of sight we'd be able to see the castle from here. Which speaks to the fact it's not that high, which is weird for a castle.
Well, in a nice moment of serendipity, we got that observation satisfactorily addressed.
So, one very interesting fact is that we were at a church, and you may have noticed that a while ago we were talking about how weird it is that the castle didn't appear to be built on the highest piece, like it seemed to be quite low down. And then we were speaking to some guy at the church, and he informed us that the castle was not only destroyed, but the hill it was on was destroyed as well. And that's why the castle isn't on as high ground as you might think.
We went past a restaurant that was also an old church on our way to head to another church. But this church had a few significant features that made it interesting. Firstly, it had a good amount of information in the church, some of which was about local history.
Lieutenant James Still, and basically, you can kind of see it here, it's explaining how he died in Sierra Leone fighting against slavery, because obviously the British Empire outlawed the slave trade, and there were many British military expeditions in West Africa to stop slavery. So he died off the coast of Sierra Leone, enforcing obedience to that sacred law, which to the honour of his country and the spirit of Christian love forbade the traffic in human blood.
One thing I found especially interesting was an explanation of a Greek palindrome written on a plaque.
You can see there it's like neon or whatever it's supposed to be, and then if you read it backwards, you know.
The church was also very pretty, and all the more so with the Christmas decorations, which were up in anticipation of the church's Christmas carol service, which we just happened to stumble upon.
So we're in St. Mary's Church, and there seems to be some kind of carol service going on, which we weren't prepared for.
We had no idea this carol service was supposed to be happening, but we decided to stick around for it.
Oh, come, O ye faithful, joyful and triumphant.
After this, we went for lunch at a local cafe.
What are you going for? That's a good one, yeah. Okay. You alright to do a bite of yours for a bite of mine? Yeah, great.
The food was pretty good, although if I'm being honest, mine was a bit greasy, so it probably ranks lowest out of the 3 lunches we had.
So we just ate at a place, and I almost robbed the guy. I asked him to change the £10 note.
He said, hold on, where's my money?
He was really nice, really friendly guy. And then, I said, oh, can you change the £10 note? He said, yeah, of course. I gave him the tip. And I walk out and he's like, wait, you still have my £10? So I almost robbed him.
After this, our last major activity for the day was to head to the National Justice Museum.
Wow, Hannah. Look at all these uncivilized, backwards countries that had executions.
This was the most expensive experience of the whole trip, but there was definitely quite a lot to do there. The big highlight, which warrants mentioning early, is that there was a mock hanging and I was selected as the prisoner to be hanged.
Our things have a convict number on them, and apparently we'll be able to find out what our crimes are.
We weren't allowed to film, but it was a lot of fun. The whole time I was wondering how they'd avoid actually putting a rope around my neck. Eventually a woman walked in and revealed that I'd been pardoned, but that I'm still wanted for a separate charge, for which I was shipped off to a penal colony in Australia.
I was due to be hanged for some kind of rioting or something, and Hannah could have signed a petition to let me go, and she didn't. She didn't. So I was scheduled to hang, but then at the last minute I was saved because there was a king's pardon which said that I should go to Australia instead. So let's find out all about that.
The one horrifying piece of information that stuck with me is that there was one penal colony in Australia where the inmates were forced to constantly wear masks so they were entirely stripped of their identity or any sense of being human.
If you were sent to a different country, what 3 things would you take with you?
Clothes? No. Like individual things?
I don't know, Hannah. I was going to count you as a thing.
A blanket and a jacket.
Underwear, a blanket, and a jacket. Good choice. What about, I would take the Bible.
Oh my gosh, that too.
And I would take an electricity generator and a laptop.
That it doesn't exist.
Okay. If I were to be sent to a different country, where would it be? Well, you know,
I would want to go to...
I would like to go to America, and you would like to go to England. That would... Oh, no, but then we go the opposite. Oh, no, yeah, then we stop like that. I mean, to be honest, Australia is not a bad choice.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Australia's fine.
Funnily enough, even though it was called the National Justice Museum, it had a disproportionate focus on the more cruel and unusual punishments that would generally be considered unjust by today's standards. One of the examples given of progress is that they eventually started weighing prisoners to calibrate how long the rope would have to be when they were hanged, such that their neck would break instantly instead of being slowly strangled, which I suppose is an improvement to how things used to be.
Women's prison wasn't so bad because they got to do their favourite thing, laundry.
The museum was quite difficult to navigate with all the different intersecting dungeons and exhibits. At one point we found ourselves in a courthouse where there were supposed to be mock trials, but we missed that this visit. After this we met with my parents and went to visit a memorial for my late cousin.
Right, everybody, so we just saw Tom's bench, paid our respects, all that. He died, 2014, so 8 years ago today.
And finally, we headed home to my grandparents one more time to hang out as a more complete family while I recited rude limericks with my granddad.
Who had a peculiar feeling?
No, who went on a bus ride to Ealing.
Of course he did.
Peter Lee with Patty in the background. And that is Sadie.
He saw a sign on the door, don't spit on the floor. He stood up and spat on the ceiling. Jolly good.
The reason my parents were there is because the next day we were heading down to a family gathering in Oxford, which is in fact something I've already covered in my previously uploaded Christmas vlog. Chronologically, all of this actually occurred before Christmas, but not really in anticipation of Christmas, so I thought I should upload it as a separate video. But since I'm being a bit non-linear, I'd like to present a brief addendum. See, only a few weeks later, but after Hannah had gone home, we actually went to Nottingham again as a family to watch my mother and auntie participate in a concert. This also allowed me to film my cousin's bench in the full light of day. Since I'd already been walking around Nottingham for a whole day, I had a delightful sense of knowing my way around and being the guide for my family.
Here comes the river Trent.
I decided while we were waiting for my mum's concert, it would be good to do the one thing that we hadn't had time to do with Hannah, which was visit the Contemporary Art Museum just down the road from the National Justice Museum. Since this is intended as a brief addendum, I won't go into much detail about the Contemporary Art Museum.
Kind of reminds me of when the ships arrive at Tol Eressëa in the Undying Lands.
Oh, yeah.
Piloted by the Teleri. I don't know, like, just the way the moon's in the sky.
This is Jesus.
Oh wait, this is Joseph Wright.
Yeah.
Oh wait, is it?
Derby.
Yes, of Derby. Just in case you were confusing with other Joseph Wrights. Of course, we know all about Derby. Do you have any cans of tomato soup, Dad, to save the planet with? Ah.
I think a lot of contemporary art has a well-deserved bad reputation, but I will say that a lot of the art here was so bizarre that it managed to justify its own existence, even if the most beautiful thing I saw in the museum was arguably the view of the church out the window.
So what is the skull?
I believe it's modelled on a dog skull,
Okay, that makes sense.
but they're all just supposed to be kind of iconic KV items. This piece is called
this
Press
key.
E to examine container, kind of like
Oh
a
yeah, video game, yeah. Makes sense. Oh, that's cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Still, I at least found a lot of the exhibits very interesting. One detail I definitely do need to include is that while we were riding a tram, I saved a woman from being separated from her child. The door closed in between them and I jumped into action and pried the doors apart. Unfortunately, I didn't think to quickly grab my camera and film my heroics, but it's okay. I don't do these things to be seen. A good deed is its own reward. I probably shouldn't have been filming during the concert, but I did, so here's a clip of some beautiful singing. What was totally different from anything I've ever seen before is that the concert actually consisted of the composer workshopping the pieces as he went along. So the choir would sing for a bit, then the composer would offer instruction, then they would sing some more. A generous way to describe it would be that it was a rare opportunity to see the creative process of a composer. A more cynical view would be that they were monetizing what was essentially a rehearsal. Anyway, that's the end of this video. It was quite an effort to condense these 3 visits to 3 historic cities into one vlog. Not sure how long this has ended up being, but I'll wrap up quickly and just say please like and subscribe. And like I say, this intersects with another vlog I made about Christmas, so feel free to watch that. Bye.
Time for 10,001 of the world's best jokes. See 'em to believe 'em. Where does a ghost go on Saturday nights? Somewhere he can boogie. What is a spook's favourite... Okay, now, I'm sure that there's some precedent for spook being a racially charged term. But let's ignore that. What is a spook's favourite ride? A roller coaster. Lodger. This steak is like a cold day in June, Mrs. Boredom. Very rare. And your board bill is like March weather. Always unsettled. Oh my god, like, someone told me that joke, I would just be like, how would I even contain myself? Yeah. Lady, are you sure this salmon is fresh? Salesman, fresh? Why, madam, I've just had to cut him up to keep him from jumping at the flies. Okay, like, I get, like, the joke is, I think, like, the joke's, like, that there's flies around him, so he's not fresh, but, like, the implication is that he would jump at, okay. I don't like that fellow, Brown. Why not? He's the sort of man who pats you on the back to your face and smacks you in the eye behind your back. So, one more. Did you hear about the frog who became a secret agent? He wanted to be a cloak and dagger man. Why don't bananas snore? This makes no sense at all. They don't want to waken the rest of the bunch? Like, how is that even a joke?
Because bananas come in bunches.